Hi, everyone. Alrighty, we're just going to let everyone kind of filter in and we'll kick off in a second. Cool. So, we might get things underway just as we're a minute past one, and others might be joining us as we go forward. So I just want to say hi, thanks for coming. My name is Daniel Stone. I wanted to first begin by acknowledging that I am on Darkinjung country. I'm normally living in Sydney, which is the Gadigal country, and I know that often these kind of acknowledgements of country can seem like a bit of just a point of process, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that, especially in times like this, that Australia has an extremely long history. All these lands have an extremely long history, and there's a lot more we could do to be supporting our Indigenous First Peoples. I wanted to also start by kind of acknowledging a few people who helped bring this series together. Hopefully you've joined us on a couple of the other episodes we've done over this week. We had Tim Costello on Monday, which was really wonderful, and we had Sam Mostyn on Wednesday, which was fantastic as well. In fact, and also Catherine Murphy on Tuesday, and then on Thursday we had Tony Burke as well. I realised I just started naming a few people, and I didn't want to do an injustice by not naming any of them, but a really wonderful slate of folk who came and joined us over the course of the week to share their views about what they're doing at the moment to kind of help manage what's going on, and what we can kind of do to be a part of that process. Australia at Home as a thing is really designed to be a meeting place for civil society in Australia at the moment, to equip us all to keep making a really positive impact in solidarity with one another through this time. I know that a number of different organisations have sprung up to try and bring people together, but our goal here is really just to try and think a bit bigger and a bit broader, when so much of our thinking has been anchored in the really small, the really immediate, and the really kind of panic-stricken, to be honest. So here we want to cheer each other on, to support each other, and really to try and focus on some bigger ideas and some things that touch more on the long term. The Project Principal Co., which is the organisation I work in, The Guardian, the Centre for Australian Progress, Essential, the Community Council of Australia, and the Australian Climate Foundation. So a really broad spread of people as well, which is wonderful to see. One thing I did want to quickly touch on is a few ground rules before we get the discussion underway. So we're recording this conversation to share later with folk who aren't able to make it. So if that's an issue, please let us know. You can write to either myself or to Jess Hearn, who you see in the chat off to the side. Do open the chat if you haven't already. That way you can put in your thoughts, opinions, or any questions you might have as the discussion flows forward. What we're going to do is keep everyone on mute for most of the session, but if you put questions into the chat, we'll kind of call upon you to kind of step forward, and we'll unmute you so that you can speak. So you don't need to do anything. We'll manage that for you, but I'll be kind of saying, oh, hey, Lauren or Ted or whoever it might be, we know you've got a really interesting question. Can you share it with the group? We also really, really encourage you to keep your video on. I know that a bunch of you already have, which is fantastic. I think that in these kind of odd times, it's really, really wonderful to see each other. And so I know you might be, have your hair all messed up or whatever it might be, but to be fair, we're all in that same position. And I encourage you, if you can, to flick your video on, and also switch your screen to the gallery view as well, so you can see each other. I think that's a really nice thing in these times, just to see other people. Cool, so we've, just to begin the session, which is the exciting thing, the thing we're all here for, we've got two really great and really experienced psychologists joining us in Lauren Moulds and in Ruth Nelson, who are going to share some reflections on how they have been seeing and reflecting on all the things that have been happening, and the people that and the way it's been affecting some of the people that they've worked with. But before I open that up, guess I just wanted to put some like positioning thoughts. Like, I think that over the last few weeks, as I mentioned in the kind of description for this event, we've just heard so much about how this is an exceptional or challenging or unprecedented or strange or difficult times. We seem to be running out of adjectives to explain like what is going on. And however, whichever one you prefer, whichever one you choose, I think we can all agree that it is extremely odd. And it is forcing us to rethink our coping mechanisms, our routines, the way we think about our work and our family and the people we love and value, and also about the way our societies work. And I think that this is a really interesting opportunity to be really deliberate about that and really intentional rather than a bit reactive. But in order to do that, I think we need to be really reflective about what are the things we draw a lot of strength from and what are the things that are a bit unnecessary. But before we get into too much of the conceptual stuff, I want to start by asking both Lauren and Ruth the same questions that we've asked many of our speakers over the last week, which is, and I might start with you, Lauren, and then I'll come to you, Ruth. How are you going? How are you feeling in this weird time?
Okay, I'll go. So you asked me to go first. So I'm Lauren, everybody. Hello. How am I feeling? I am a huge extrovert, so I'm finding this period of isolation or being distant from people generally a bit challenging. However, what I am enjoying is the slowing down of pace and I guess more time just to be. And I think what I've really noticed myself personally is that the last week or the last few weeks, I felt really on edge and felt really very connected to this crisis that's been going on really across what's happened with the news. And I felt this week almost a settlement into this is just the norm now. And I think there's been, still announcements, perhaps less big change, less sort of shifts in regards to restrictions. So I kind of feel like this week, the anxiety part of it has sort of dropped for me personally, and I've kind of just now falling into what seems to be this new sense of normal and trying to adjust to that as best I can with a 18-month-old and while working at home and juggling everything in the in-between. So I think for me personally, how I'm going is okay at the moment, and just trying to test out my extrovert skills by engaging in lots of these kind of meetings.
What about you, Ruth?
I think like many people, and thank you for having me here. I'm very grateful, and I will just acknowledge that I am on Gadigal Wongal land. I'm 3 flights of stairs off it, but I can see some of the trees that grow out of it. I'm okay, and I'm not okay, and that is okay. You know, the things that I am grateful for are that I have shelter and electricity and water, and I have work that I can do from home, and I have children to keep me company and bring hope. And at the same time, the work is driving me mad and the children are driving me mad, and I'm neurotypical and extroverted, so I would like to be out with people. And that's great. It is what it is.
And I guess to kind of build off that with your, do you want to maybe, I realized I didn't speak too much about your professional experience, which I definitely should have done in our introduction, but maybe if you want to share with the room what your lens is and how you come to this, and also like how through that lens you've been seeing the world, like what have your observations been about the state of things?
I do love being asked about my opinion on the state of things, but it is my opinion. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and that's one of my identities. And I try to practice the advice that's given to, like I occupy a lot of privilege. I'm white, I'm cis, I have a lot of things that make my life relatively easy. But I try and take that advice of listening to people who have identities and multiple identities that make experiences even harder for them. So like people then who are experiencing food insecurity, people who are having a lot of trouble getting access to testing for coronavirus. I'm trying to be mindful that, so I guess a lot of the ways that I've lived my life, I've been fortunate to come professionally and personally into contact with people who experience structural oppression and the consequences of that. So I'm kind of spending a lot of time thinking about this pandemic and what it reveals in our society that wasn't necessarily really clear. It wasn't as clear to people like me before this about structural inequality and how that is revealed in disaster. It's a bit of a rambling answer, sorry.
No, that's right. And what are some of the things you think it's revealed?
I mean, we all know that capitalism the goal point of capitalism isn't health and well-being. Like, we knew that already, but like, you can feel that right now. You can feel it in the lines around Centrelink. You can feel it in the way that perhaps, I'm a psychologist, so I kind of need to stay in my lane, but I feel like there's some of the stimulus packages in this country are designed to help people like me, middle-class people who have relatively easy lives. You know, they're not necessarily designed to help the people who come to consult with me, not designed to make their lives too much easier. In thinking about this webinar today, one of the things I did in a previous life, I've worked over in conflict zones in East Africa, and I've got permission to talk about this person who I was talking with this morning about this webinar. He's a former child soldier, and he was saying that for him, what's really important and what he wants me to bring up today is that, you know, it reveals a lot about poverty and the way that when you are poor, you are judged very differently to when you have resources. And that actually, he says, what we do is we segregate people who are vulnerable. So we segregate people with disabilities. We segregate people who are poor. We criminalize being poor and women as well. He was pointing out the ways in which the pandemic is a disaster for women in particular. I'm glad I remembered to bring all of those things up. He was very clear that I had to say all those things.
I think that's a super interesting point. And one thing, I might throw to Lauren, but I do want to come back to that because I think there's something that's really interesting to expand on. But yeah, so Lauren, looking at it through your perspective and the people that you've worked with, do you want to maybe tell us a bit about what that background looks like, and also what some of the observations it's helped form for you?
Sure. So I'm a psychologist. I wear many hats as a psychologist. I'm a bit of a multitasker, so I work both within government and also privately. I run my own practice, and I also have done a PhD and hold some titles at a few universities, and I lecture and supervise some academic projects there. And I think all of those different sectors have kind of been impacted in different ways. But I think what I can say that my broad observations from all of those roles is that everyone's instinct has kind of been the same, which is they want someone to blame or something to blame for this happening. And I think something to blame for the fact that it's occurring at all, or that we're not prepared, or just looking for something to kind of draw a fault on. And I think also what everyone's looking for is a way to fix it. And I think that's a real human quality. We know humans are their fix-it muscles really well established and really well built. So I think one of the things that I've really noticed across all those fields is that people want the answer, like how do we make it better, and then how do we cure it, how do we get through it. And I think the reality of it is that there's no simple answer to that, and that's a real challenge, I think, because as humans we drive for control, we drive for the solution, we drive for the answer, and the fact that we don't have that right now, and this is something that, you know, we've not been prepared for or predicted, or we don't know where it's going, is really confronting for people. I think the other thing that I really noticed, particularly in my clinical work with people, is that it's really now turned to anxiety being the norm. You know, often with people that experience anxiety, it's often people look at them and go, why are you anxious? Stop worrying. Don't think about that, that kind of dialogue. Whereas I think the shift really now has been, if you're not worrying, people think that's the problem now. And there's been that real shift that we should all be anxious and we should all be afraid. And if we're not taking it seriously, and we're not aware enough of what's happening. So I think that real shift, and almost the whole, country, the whole world, all communities being afraid, is both really normalizing and beautiful in some sense, because we feel connected in that fear, but also terrifying because we're used to sort of not everyone around us being afraid, and having safe people feel afraid is a real challenge. And when I work with parents or work with families, it's a big challenge for parents to sort of contemplate how they've got to deal with their worries while holding a safe space for their family, or for managers to work out how they can deal with their own anxiety and provide some sense of direction or some sense of leadership for the people that they're supporting. So I think the real challenge is that this is something that everyone in Australia is experiencing. This isn't occurring just as a subset, and it's a real challenge of how do you hold your own feelings and your own space for yourself while having to hold space for others. And obviously that's something psychologists have to do. But I think a lot of managers, a lot of bosses, a lot of parents, a lot of other people in other spaces, a lot of leaders are are being put into challenging places where they have to hold this safe space and have to work out how to both take care of themselves as well as take care of others, and that's quite confronting.
That's really interesting. I guess, like, on that point, like, what are, like, tips for people who want to hold that space? How do we, like, what is some helpful advice there? Because I know a lot of people who are on this are either in positions within NGOs where they might have a lot of members or staff or people turning to them, and themselves being very anxious, or even just straight up just being in carer roles. I know there's a whole bunch of parents on the line as well who live in that space as well. So, like, how can you hold space for others while managing your own and create a sense of security or love, I guess, when there is none, or no security anyway?
Is that for me, Daniel?
It is, yeah.
So I think that the first thing is that it's totally okay to acknowledge that you are feeling that. Like, I think that could be a really helpful first step of being able to go, I'm really scared too, and being able to call that. And I think it's a really good for parents and for others to know that that's okay. But I think what is really important is being able to kind of call that and say that, and not necessarily have to kind of behave in line with that. I mean, in the end, what we can control now is just how we behave. So we can't control our feelings. Our feelings are there. We can say, I'm feeling afraid, but we can say something like, but we're safe right here in this moment, or right now in the present, things are okay. I think for managers or for anyone in general, what we know about humans is that we're incredibly egocentric. So when we hear news and when we hear announcements, the first question people want to know, whether they say it out loud or not, is like, what does this mean for me personally? And I think that the fault that a lot of managers or leaders can fall into is feeling like there is information overload, that people are just getting slogged with information. And what they do is like, well, I'm not going to add another email, or I'm not going to add another meeting or another point of communication because everyone's getting so much information. But I think my advice is the opposite. You know, write an email, have a meeting, have a Zoom chat where you go, okay, this is this bit of news. This is exactly what it means for you all here. This is what it means for you personally, for our staff, for me, everything like that. I think that's really important. And I think more than anything for all those groups is being clear is kind. So I think being unclear is unkind, to quote the beautiful Brene Brown, who I take all of my wise words of wisdom for today. And I think really what that means is that, you know, it's not helpful to be vague or to make promises we can't keep, or to be uncertain about what we're saying. I think it might be clear of going, look, I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know if we're going to have to, you know, go to the line of redundancy or reduced hours. I don't know that yet, but what I can tell you is as soon as I do know, I will let you know. And I can tell you that I'm going to be open in that communication, and that you can come and chat with me about that when you can. And in terms of just holding space for others, as I said, going full circle back, first one, I guess, is really naming the feeling, and the second is practicing those skills of emotional regulation, taking some deep breaths, thinking before those difficult conversations of really putting your own oxygen mask on first, taking some calm breaths, going for a walk, really recentering yourself before you have to hold the space for somebody else.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Ruth, one thing that you mentioned earlier, which I thought was really interesting, was talking about how there's a whole bunch of people who kind of fall through the cracks in our society generally, but that is even more acute and even more concerning in this kind of current environment where, as a result of us all being in our homes, our perspective of the world has really become limited by essentially what we see on broadcast media or within our very socially, cultural and class-bound kind of social networks online. And so I guess my question to you is, like, could you have a sense of what is happening more broadly, and also kind of related to that, what are things that, and to be frank, like a lot of the people who are on this line look fairly white, fairly middle class, fairly metropolitan. What can people from this kind of general kind of class and cultural background do to be supportive to kind of vulnerable communities in this time, who may not be geographically near us, or we may not have a lot of social ties with?
Those are great questions. And like, I loved what Lauren was saying there. That stuff is all so important, and such great advice there. And it was making me think, I did this great course with Ray Johnson. They ran this embodied social justice course. And I love how they talk about this idea of resourcing. So I personally hate the idea of self-care. I've gotten myself all worked up about how often many of the structures in our society, and so the mental health structures as well, kind of narrow down onto an individual. as, you know, so if you've got anxiety, it's kind of your job to deal with that. And kind of if you don't deal with that, then that's kind of in a way your fault. You know, you should get up and exercise. You should do all this self-care. Like if you just take a bath, you'll be okay, really. I know I'm simplifying that a bit too much. But resourcing is like, so yeah, that's great. We've got these personal resources. I can practice my mindfulness. I can practice those things Lauren was talking about. Those are such important things. And then how do I draw down from and feed back into the resources of the circles around me? So if we start talking about this idea of imagined communities, so we have this imagined community of Australia, right? We're not actually a community. Like, who is Australia? What even is that? So we're an imagined community. So we can draw down.
I think we may have. I think we might have lost Ruth momentarily. I might come back to. I was very compelled by that point. Okay. What we might do is get some of our wonderful little tech helpers to reach out to Ruth and see what we can do there. In the meantime,
This is like.
Oh, you're back, Ruth. Hey. I think we lost you momentarily. You were talking about imagined communities, and then the internet dropped out a little bit.
Excellent. So these imagined communities of this imagined community of Australia, and I'm trying to make a couple of points. I'm sorry, I'm squeezing too much into that point. But the community is there where you go see if your neighbours are okay by sending a note through their letterbox, by using internet-based groups like mutual aid, like Facebook for things like that, and call on those resources yourself. So using those immediate resources in the ways that you can. Support people who need shopping, ask other people when you need help with your shopping right now. Get on those Zoom chats with your friends and with people who resource you, that you can talk with in the evenings, with those moments when you can just be vulnerable, to get through this by just being vulnerable for a moment. But also, here we come to your question about, my question is, who is left out? So for me here in Sydney, who is left out? Who is left out is often like refugees, homeless people right now who, you know, if I was just noticing one of the comments there about, you know, if you've got mental health diagnoses in your home and you've suddenly lost a lot of the resources you were using to get through, like, what do you do? Like, where do you go to right now? Because there aren't enough resources. And I'm just thinking, sorry, yeah, go. You can.
Actually, like, it brings up a kind of expansion question, and please do keep putting thoughts and questions into the chat. So what do you think about the stimulus packages that have been announced so far? So I think there's a broader conversation about whether or not the existing mental health system provides enough support, but in this period of crisis, do you think that has been enhanced? Do you think that it's some of the stimulus packages have exacerbated things? Like, what are the kind of and I, you know, obviously you guys aren't economists, but as practitioners, what do you think the impacts of what's been announced so far are likely to be?
Now, my answer to that isn't an original thought from myself. It's from Feminism and Decolonisation, which is a group on Facebook. She's a person on Facebook that I follow, and I'm acknowledging that. So as a white cis person, I'm not appropriating ideas given to me by other people with different identities to mine. I think that's important to acknowledge. But she was making this comment that kind of initially, in that initial panic, we were pulling together a lot more. We were all saying, like, we're losing our work hours here. We're losing a lot of the resources we've got personally and societally. It's being revealed that the safety net of this country doesn't catch us. It does. When we're meant to pool our resources, so when there's disaster, we've got enough, you know, enough public health, we've got enough mental health, we've got enough safety nets in Centrelink to get us through. The safety nets have been ripped away over the years, and with the communities that I consult with in Australia, that is abundantly clear, that people, prior to this, clients who have to choose between nappies and toilet paper, like up at 2 a.m. trying to get something from their Centrelink money so that they could, you know, have $12 this week for food for themselves and 3 kids. the safety nets are not adequate. And the point that was made there was that one of the effects of the stimulus packages are that they then divide us again along those class lines, because suddenly the people who are now coping again, the middle class, suddenly lose that sense of solidarity with people who aren't working enough, with the really vulnerable people. So yet again, they don't have a voice, and we're not speaking on their behalf either, because suddenly we feel better, so we've stopped shouting and screaming, and so we haven't maintained. That's the intersectionality, right? I'm up here, I'm okay, I'm going to stop fighting for any people down there because it doesn't affect me any longer. So I think one of the things we need to be doing, and what's great about this, is it helps you as an individual feel better as well. Even if it doesn't help you directly, it helps your mental and emotional health. Connection, one of our basic human needs is connection. We feel safety in connection. So if you connect by advocating for the people below you in the food chain, if you push up to the politicians, push up to the decision makers, push up to the media, push up in things like this, get involved, it is a chance to build that connection and to build that imagined community and make it safer.
Yeah.
Imagine bringing more people into the imagined community of Australia so that First Nations people are more fully human in our eyes and more fully deserving of safety nets and support and voice, treaty, all kinds of things could happen. This could be a great moment. This could be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really, really great point there that like we should be making sure we're directing energy at those who can take action to support those around us. I might, at this point, actually start trying to bring some of the folk who've made really interesting comments in the chat in. So to start with, Sophia McGrain, I was wondering if you'd be comfortable sharing your story. It sounds like you have a really challenging situation, and I'd love to understand a bit more about what that looks like. So we'll just unmute you, and hopefully you'll be able to come and say hi. Have we got you, Sophia? I feel like we're on an old school radio show. Okay, I might, cool, might move forward, but she's got a really interesting point that I would love to bring forward if we get a chance. Another question that I kind of wanted to kind of explore was, you can't unmute, but maybe we can, cool, is that, yeah, Jess and or Ariana, are you able to grab Sophia?
She is currently unmuted. It might be an audio problem.
Drats. Sorry about that. But I think the other thing I kind of wanted to, let me just scroll back up. I think Tim had a really interesting point too, which was about the current kind of system, which kind of continues on the same thought we were just having. Let me just find you. Or Tristan, sorry. Yeah, Tristan Ryall. I'm interested to hear your thoughts and experiences with the current system. It sounds like you've been quite frustrated.
You're asking a question, dude.
Yep. Hey. Hey, Tristan, we've unmuted you. We were wondering if you wanted to pose some of the experiences you've had with the current mental health system.
I have a crying baby on my lap, so
oh, good.
You're able to hear me.
I think the one nice thing about this period of being at home is we're actually confronted with each other's full personal lives.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting to see everyone's backdrops that they choose to sit in front of. My experience, I work from home anyway, so in a lot of ways my experience is no different to normal. And so I must feel separate to everyone else's experience of everything being different, almost on the outside of it. But yes, I'm almost feel like I'm on the outside looking in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely, that makes sense. I might pose another question to both Lauren and Ruth, which is around thinking about some of these kind of structural questions. I think that this has also revealed a lot about, as I think Ruth was saying in her introduction, how societies kind of work and what they're actually capable of doing, especially and also simultaneously how much mental health is kind of the consequence of a much larger system and structural forces, as Ruth was also saying, that it's not just, it's often unhelpful to say it's your problem, go deal with it. And I think Lauren touched on that as well. So the takeaway from that is that if you're not coping with it, or if you're struggling, it's rarely just your own fault. It's usually part of something much bigger. And if that is true, like, what can we kind of do as a society, not just necessarily as individuals? What can we start doing, or who should we start pushing to take action on improving well-being for the long term as well, not just in this period of challenge and change? And so, like, that's an open question to both Ruth and Lauren, depending on who wants to grab it first.
I'll grab it because it looks like Ruth is doing a bit of a dance at the moment, so which I can empathise with. I don't know if I can comment as articulately as Ruth has around structural issues. I think really it's about what I would say on the point before, and I think this relates to the mental health stuff, is I think we're in a point of such crisis, and I think not saying that I think the government's doing an exceptional job at all, but what I would say is I think we're dealing with something, and decisions are being made and stimulus packages are being made very, very quickly in a very evolving environment with very, in retrospect, very limited evidence or understanding of exactly what they're doing. So what I'm really excited about is what's going to happen from a structural level post this period of time, and when we kind of look at what lessons can be learned through this, and how we can grow from that, and really what the resilience of that is from a broader scale, I guess. And I think how that relates to mental health is that that we know some of the pillars of good mental health, or kind of some good ways to ensure that you're taking care of your mental health, are things like, as Ruth's drawn a lot, feeling connected, feeling part of a community, feeling a sense of things, and you know, using formats like this are really useful, but this is a privilege. Some people don't have internet, some people don't have computers that they can connect with people to, like this, or phones that they can use to connect with. And I think even without this, you know, we know humans need touch for good mental health. They need physical contact. You know, the power of hug cannot be undenied, and one of the reasons I'm an avid hugger. And I think for a lot of people that are alone during this period, the deterioration of their mental health is going to be really a consequence of a lack of connection. And I think what we're going to see is that feeling of connection is going to shift in terms of people being really appreciative of that. You know, I can't wait till my beautiful mum's tuned in. I can see her in the photo at the moment, and I can't wait till I can give her a hug. And you know, that's something that's really important for me, for my mental health. So I think that will be a big shift. I think the other shift with mental health is we know things like routine, habits, exercise, that sort of stuff is really shifting. So I think what we're going to see for people with mental illness and mental health in general is that I think people are going to experience poorer mental health more broadly. Like, I think mental illness is going to rise during this period of time, or mental ill health is going to rise. And I think what it's going to force the system to do is to recognise that it is similar to this pandemic, a global issue, and does have significant impact on people's ability to recover and to retrain. So I think these lessons are going to be really useful to sort of push some shifts around how to better support that. And I've seen in the chat a lot of comments around, can the mental health system cope with this? No, similar to other health things, I think we're under huge strain and under a lot of busyness. I'm optimistic with the telehealth change that, you know, a lot of these practices can continue, and that psychologists can continue some outreach work. But again, it really depends on whether people have got the resources and capacity to engage in this sort of way, I think. So I think, again, it's one of the ones where with mental illness and mental health, now we're kind of forced in a zone of going, this really depends on who can reach those systems, and a lot of those systems have now become a very privileged place to be in because of where people are working from, and how they can access those services, and psychologists' ability to kind of get with and with community and be with family and that sort of thing at the same time. So that's probably a bit of a roundabout way of answering your question, Daniel, but that's the best I got. So I'll hand over to Ruth, who I'm sure will do a much more articulate job of this question.
And I think just as a point of conclusion while Ruth steps in, I think that's a really interesting observation. I think that the point that I'm taking from that is that the idea of actually just like democratizing, like essentially setting up much more many more mental health service providers in all sorts of different forms in many more different locations. Like, I think that it's really revealed that there's a real geographic, really geographic disparity for a lot of people when it comes to accessing these services, amongst other things. But yeah, Ruth, do you have any thoughts on what can we do to make the system better in the long term, and not just necessarily the mental health system, but many of the systems within society?
I mean, UBI has got to be one of the biggest answers there, right? Again, I'm a psychologist, I'm not an economist, but when it comes to what is important in life, is it this fantasy of endless economic growth, or is it a planet we can live on? You know, one of the things that's going on globally right now, so 10 years ago, over where I was working in Sudan and northern Uganda, the communities there were really clear that the climate was changing. They used to know to the day when to plant, and even 10 years ago, they had no idea anymore. It was a mystery. If you plant, it works, it doesn't work. So people die. Quite simply, people died. The word for blanket there was actually the word for coffin. It was the same word. So that's what people were buried in. It's at the moment then, around the world, people are trying to figure out how they keep dealing with adaptation to climate change and how you deal with a pandemic. So like food insecurity is massive. Here in Australia, food insecurity is largely unnoticed. There's communities in Australia that experience food insecurity. So people are not getting that basic need met properly. No, you can't. Sorry. And the strategies that I would suggest around that are again about that connection, like listen. So say at the center of the circle. He can't hear one thing. Everyone here can. Everyone can hear one thing. Say at the center of the circle, there are the people who make the decisions that affect our society and affect global society. They're the people you talk to. The people that you listen more and more to the people who are closer and closer to the edge of the circle. The more marginalized people are from decision making and power, they are the people to listen to. And it is so tempting often to say, because that is not my experience, that cannot be a true experience. You know, as a woman, I experience that when men simply dismiss what it is that I experience because they don't experience it themselves. And I'm sure that non-cis people and people here who experience family violence and get gaslighted out of that in so many ways, the people who are living the experience and walking those identities, listen to them. You've got to listen to them. And that makes you a better person too. That makes you healthier and happier because you are in relational movement with those people. And right now, one of the things we need to do to feel better, you know, Lauren was commenting on that lack of touch being hard right now. Movement, find the movement of your own body and find that relational movement in the way that you listen really deeply to other identities and other people.
Daniel, I was also just going to add quickly that I think one of the things that is, I think, really challenging at the moment to listen to with what Ruth's saying and to make sure we're taking on board other people's experiences is we know when people are anxious and when they're afraid, they go into that survival brain, and that survival brain is very us-focused, very threat-focused, very focused on keeping alive and really driven by emotions, and that kind of ability to think cognitively or plan or to kind of empathize and make clear decisions is compromised. So I think as well, that's the challenge, is how do we kind of include those voices and listen in a point where everybody is not built to or wired to from a cognitive perspective. And most importantly, when this does calm, how do we kind of then make sure we are listening to grow effectively from it? And I think also what's going to be really interesting from a mental health perspective is I think a lot of people during the trauma of what's happening, I know one of the comments drew on kind of, for some Australians, this has been a year of incredible, unimaginable trauma in regards to bushfires, as well as what's happening now of, you know, loss of country, loss of land, loss of identity around that, is they're still in that midst of that trauma. And so they haven't really even been able to start to make sense of that yet, or make place of that yet, or realise what the world is yet. And I think that the mental health impacts are going to be then when people can step out of this trauma and we kind of can see a lot of those huge impacts. That's when the additional pressure is going to also be on, because at the moment, some of my clients are saying like I'm so overwhelmed with everything happening. I can't sit in a room and you know, be reflective and grow and discuss things with you in a therapeutic sense. They're kind of just like, I'm just surviving. I'm just, you know, worrying about how to feed my kids, how to do this, how to do that, how to adapt. I don't have time for that kind of sense of reflection. So I think that's going to come, and I think that we're going to see the impacts of this really long term as people start to process what is, you know, a nationwide, a global wide trauma.
Yeah, and there's something kind of oddly grounding about it too, in that it's kind of one of the first big challenges that I've seen that affects everyone across the world pretty equally, no matter their wealth or privilege, which is kind of interesting. What I might do is I have a follow-up question on something that you were saying earlier, but I'm also just kind of wanted to indicate, and this might work a little bit better, that there's a few questions that are in the chat, and I'm going to call you guys forward in a moment. So Jackie Softly had a really interesting question about fear and anxiety in intellectual disability communities. Peter Fitzgerald had a really interesting question about anxiety with media coverage. And Stephen also had a really interesting question about that kind of touched on some of the stuff you were just saying about, Lauren, about the mental health impacts of a sustained period of crisis with bushfires and stuff like that beforehand. So just letting you guys know that we'll call you forward in a second. But my question, I guess, to both of you, but really building on a point that Lauren made, was about just, you know, how much humans are built for physicality or intimacy, even though we have different thresholds. But like, that's something that I think a lot of people, even introverts I know, have claimed to be really missing over the last couple of weeks. So are there things like on a practical level for us running sessions like this one, and for many of us doing it in the rest of our professional lives at the moment, are there things that we can do to make these online environments more intimate and more comforting? Like, are there any like kind of tips that you've developed or you've observed people do really well that creates that sense of connection over, you know, the tyranny of distance?
I think, you know, these sort of formats, the best way to, I think, really feel connected is to make it real, like as real as you can. Like the people, you know, that I've seen people watching this, you know, smile when, you know, Ruth's got her little one, or she's, you know, having to talk to her kids, or before when, you know, Tristan had his little bubba on him. Like, I think that's what makes us feel connected, if it feels real. If it doesn't, in many ways, I've got the worst case scenario here. I've got a pretty blank background and you're not really getting a real sense of me or what's happening in my world right now. But I think that if we can use these formats to just really reveal, Ruth drew on vulnerability before, and I think that's really important, of kind of showing the messy house, showing the messy kitchen table, and being really real in what's happening with that. But I think that the other part of your question in regards to sort of how do we meet those needs around physical touch and around kind of physical need, I mean, that's one that we really can't do in this kind of environment. I don't want to delve into how people might engage in other more sexual touch in this, or sexual intimacy in this sort of context. But I think what I would say about touch is that I think it's a really useful time to sort of reflect on other ways that you can get those kind of sensory needs met, and whether that be through exercise or even doing things like you know, lying on the grass outside and being kind of conscious of how that feels on your body. Or I know that like a crazy fact during this is that anxiety blankets, like weighted blankets, have sold out across the whole country, which I think really reflects that people are seeking that kind of physical sensory input. So I think that's a really interesting one. But also to draw on, I know there've been a few questions around you know, just people who have disabilities within the community and how they're kind of coping with that. And I know that for a lot of people with disabilities, they have really high sensory needs and high need for touch, and that in this current environment, it would be particularly challenging for them, particularly for if workers are kind of changing their scope of practice. Or I think even, you know, I know working with some areas where we've got people going and visiting vulnerable people in the community, just social distancing in that environment and people's sense of feeling that disconnect even when they're with them in person can be really challenging. So I think, you know, calling the awkwardness, finding a way that we can get that touch need met in other ways can be really helpful. And if you're lucky enough to have someone in your house that you share with that you're not quarantined from, I mean, avalanching them with as much physical touch as you possibly can is probably all I can recommend.
Yeah, of course. I might call Jackie forward now if you're able to as well, to kind of speak a bit about
that. Hi, folks. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I'm a parent of a man who has Down syndrome, and I have other family members with disabilities. At the moment, you know, I take on board all of the anxieties that the rest of the general community have. But I just feel that, as Ruth said, there are some people who are just not really acknowledged as having additional anxieties at the moment and additional sort of practical problems. So people with disabilities are faced with maybe not getting the support that they need at the moment because they're at home and maybe their support workers can't come to them. They can't go out and do things that they usually do, all of those kinds of things. People with disabilities and carers have been missed out of the $550 supplement, despite costs going up and people really struggling financially anyway. A lot of people also had part-time jobs, and of course they've gone, but our community isn't eligible for things like JobKeeper because they're on pension. So there's all of that. There's all of those anxieties. But I particularly want to mention that I'm very well connected, particularly in the Down syndrome community, and I'm being contacted a lot by parents whose sons and daughters are having huge anxiety because it's very difficult to understand all of this. And a lot of people don't have the speech to communicate their anxieties either. Down Syndrome Australia has been doing some great work, and I've worked with them to produce easy read information, that kind of thing. Another thing we're doing is on the Down Syndrome Australia Facebook page is sharing stories, photographs and videos from people with Down syndrome so that they can say, here's what I'm doing while I'm at home. So it, you know, that we've just sort of started that happening. And I think that's going to be a positive. But for a group of people, and I'm thinking specifically people with Down syndrome here, who thrive on being in touch with other people, it is more of a challenge. And also people with Down syndrome do already have about a 30% likelihood of having mental health issues in their life. So I guess I'm really, really loving this conversation. I'm hoping to get ideas of more things we can do for our community, but I also just want to let everyone in this call know that this group, and it's a very large population of people, are having particular struggles and particular difficulties with what's going on, and I just want to make sure that they're not forgotten.
Yeah,
thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Jackie. I think that's a really powerful point, and one that I think, at least as presenters, I've definitely had some conversations with. I might extend your question and mix it in actually with Sophia McCrane's, who's just popped into the chat, which is a really like nice tangible one as well, which is like when there's somebody within your household that a lot of people turn to for support, and they're the real anchor for a family or for a team or whatever it might be. How can you make sure that that person has the bandwidth to continue playing that role? And I might open that to both Lauren and Ruth.
I would start by asking them, what do you need? What do you need from me? How can I support you? Because what each person needs can be quite different, the way those needs get met. And the best thing is to ask them, and then to listen without judgment, and to listen without offering advice. People don't actually often want advice. Often people just need to be heard, non-judgmentally heard, and to have their truth acknowledged. Like, that is hard. That is hard for you. Can I just say though that you said coronavirus around the world is something that actually affects us equally. Yes, it all affects us, but around the world, I would just like to suggest that actually it affects people very differently. So, you know, like Jackie was making that great point about the way that it impacts people with Down syndrome very differently from the ways they process it and the anxieties they have. You know, people who with existing food insecurity will die more from this. People who are tired are going to catch it more. So people who don't have the privilege of getting enough sleep are impacted by this much more strongly than me, for example, who can go to bed much earlier.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just felt the need to point that out.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Lauren, did you have any thoughts?
I think Ruth's point's a really good one about starting with asking them where they're at and what they need. I think that's really useful. But in terms of a few, I guess, practical things, I guess all anyone wants at the moment is to feel safe, right? But that's not something that really we can ever give. Like, I think if we think about it, the world is an unpredictable place and is an uncertain place, but at the moment that feels particularly true for everybody. And so I think that a lot of the anchors that we have in our families or in our friendship groups, those kind of people that tend to be strong, are being challenged by the fact that the world does feel unsafe and uncertain at the moment. So I think what I would suggest is finding some ways that you can create a little bit of sense of safety or normality within that group. So one of the things I've been really encouraging my clients to think about is the future's terrifying at the moment and even more uncertain than usual. And so really shifting that framework to going, you know, yesterday, today, tomorrow, and let's just think of it in those 3-day terms. And I think a lot of it is around thinking through, and again, not preempting what Ruth said about making sure we're asking the person what they need, but usually what people want is something that they can have control over, or a sense of agency over, that they can kind of get that build from. And also I think what people generally seek is routine and predictability and things like that. So a lot of the things that we usually give our children these senses, like, you know, making sure that they still have their bedtime story and their bath and going to bed, can be really helpful for adults in our life or other people, of trying to see what things do remain normal. So our whole world's been shifted upside down at the moment, but some things still remain the same. And I feel very lucky at the moment that I've got a little kid who, his world, as much as he's missing going to the playground, his day-to-day world is pretty much the same. You know, he has his nap at the same time and he has the same routine. He reads his books and he likes playing with the same toys. And so for adults, I think it can be the same. And so for people that are struggling, going, okay, you know, usually you would go to the gym at this time and you can't do that. Can you do a workout at home? And can we try and give you the space to do that workout so you can recharge your batteries? Or can we go for a walk as a family, and instead of spending that whole walk talking about all the things we're worried about coronavirus, or all the things we're worried about this and this and this, can we spend it having a really mindful walk where we just notice how the leaves are changing because it's autumn, or how this is happening? Or can we just lie in a park somewhere practicing social distancing and look at the clouds and just focus on that, as opposed to getting caught up in what's happening? So I think for a lot of those people, what's needed is to take some heat off sometimes, and to, knowing that they often need to kind of hold that space for us and be that safe place, thinking about how we can create a safe space for them, and whether that's predictability or having those moments out through practicing mindfulness, that can all be really helpful. And I think also just, yeah, as Ruth said, being led by them and being led by what would help them in that moment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that routine is something that I've found super useful in my own life. We're coming close to the end of the session, so I might just try and do a few quick fire questions and responses, just to kind of capture a lot of things. I might call Peter forward, who I think's already unmuted. Had a really interesting question about how to deal with the media coverage that's kind of enveloping us, and how confronting that is and will become.
So my question to the specialists are, I think about population security and well-being. And I'm thinking, maybe because I'm a pessimist, that although Australia has the bending of the curve, we're going to be witnessing on TV and social media really a tenfold potential increase in the calamity unfolding in New York and London and Paris. So Paris, France is the first country to have 1,000 deaths in a day. It could be 10 times that number within 6 or 7 weeks. So although there's a certain, pardon the word, novelty to how things are at the moment, it's going to be a whole lot darker in a month or so. How do you think we are prepared in terms of our national resilience, and how will this unfold as a public issue?
I think we're not prepared. So I think we're not prepared for most of the things around this. But what I would say is, I think that the additional challenge is that, as I said, it's one of those things where this has really been built, like coronavirus has been quite interesting from a social media or social perspective, because in Australia's word, for a while, it was that thing where it was, you know, a focus of a lot of memes, a bit of a joke. Everyone was kind of going, oh, look at all these crazy people buying toilet paper. And then there was kind of this week where everyone went, oh no, crap, this is actually a really serious issue. We've got to start taking it seriously. And then everyone started kind of Googling and researching everything they could. And there was a real thirst for knowledge and a thirst for media. And, you know, ABC and other places like that have been amazing, just providing this constant output of graphs, infographics, information, that sort of thing. So I think what's been really interesting is that we almost feel like we've come into underprepared or under knowledge, and now the thirst for knowledge is so high. And I think that the challenge with that is that we then have the vulnerability or the tendency to expose ourselves to more media than we need to, and that can be really problematic. So I think that my first answer is I don't think that there is enough resilience around that. I don't think people think about that enough, but I think that the way through that is to create some routine and some habit around that. So I don't think it's really, really realistic to go, I'm not going to tune into any news coverage or any media at all, because we need to be informed, and, you know, there's daily changes around what things are occurring with that sort of stuff. But I think it's about practicing things like, you know, checking your phone only a few times a day for updates, you know, looking at things like alerts that you can set up for when something really pressing happens, so that you're not just constantly scrolling through information, you know, just choosing one news coverage to watch a day as opposed to having the news constantly on in the background. And there's lots of really good ways from a technology perspective that you can solve that. So from a phone perspective, there's some great apps which really limit how much you're using certain apps or using your phone at all. So I think self-discipline is the answer to that, and being really conscious about how much you're tuning in and making sure we take time to tune out, and also thinking about thinking of it as a real task or a real trauma. So within the psychology profession, one of my supervisors gave me the really good advice of, you know, not reading really traumatic background information, or not having your hardest client at the end of the day, having it earlier and really structuring your day around what's most toughest, and really about how you kind of put in resource building or self-care or whatever term you want to use around that. So if you do decide to watch the 7 p.m. news, can you follow that up with a walk outside to sort of regenerate with the present moment? Can you walk around so that you've just watched news about how the whole world is falling apart? Can you balance that out with going for a walk and realizing that, you know, that might be true, but in this present moment, what's around you is okay, and there's still, you know, beautiful trees and dogs barking, and the world is still, in some moments, doing it right with where it's at. So that's my only advice on that.
Lauren, I might, I'm going to throw to Ruth for her kind of like last comments. One thing that I might briefly contribute as well is on the point about confronting death. I've been reading a lot over the last kind of 6 to 8 months about like death anxiety. I'd encourage folk who might want to explore that more to read about it. I think it's kind of really interesting because as a kind of field in the West, we don't really confront or think about our mortality. And then when it sneaks into our lives, it's quite confronting and quite jarring. And it's just not something that we're really prepared for or really at peace with. So reading in that stuff I found really helpful, and I think has made me feel a bit more personally prepared for confronting it much more frequently, as Peter said. Ruth, did you have any kind of thoughts more about how to like prepare for some of the difficult times we're yet to have?
Yeah, look, firstly, Sophia, I'm glad you found that helpful today, because it sounds like you're in a pretty tough situation there. Peter, I'm a pessimist too, don't worry, I'm with you. I feel comfortable with pessimists. Optimists live longer, and I would say it serves them right. That's my feeling. What I can say though, and bear with me here, think the fried egg. In the center, you've got the yolk. That's the pain. That's the pandemic. That's a global pandemic that is scaring the living daylights out of everyone for really good reason. That pain is real, and you're feeling it. We're all feeling it. You feel it right now. When you mention it, it's there in your throat. It's that nervous system reaction rising up from there, the polyvagal nervous system. All the white of the yolk, there is all my fears around. What does the future look like? What does UBI even mean? Should I know about that? UBI is, you know, that's not the answer. We're getting derailed here. What about my mental health? There's not enough resources. That's the stuff you can't control. That's the stuff that is just judgment and worry thoughts, and just, that is the white of the egg, and you've got to let go of the white of the egg, because you're going to drown in it, right? You're not asleep at 2 a.m. because you're waiting for the army to be coming down the streets, making people go back into their homes. It's total catastrophe. Come back to the yolk of the egg. The pain is real, and that's okay. that's the pain. Yeah, we don't know what the death toll is going to look like. I've been through a cholera epidemic. I've been through measles epidemics. I was on the edge of an Ebola outbreak. It didn't make it to where I was. It's terrifying, and it doesn't become less terrifying. You know, you spend your time looking at the black tarpaulin that keeps the cholera clinics, you know, tarpaulined off from you. You find that the source of infection is the waterborne near you, that, you know, there's no electricity in the morgue. We don't know how this is going to play out here, where we are, where we live. We could be facing, you know, enormous loss, and we're going to be bleeding for people in Yemen who are going to die in exponential numbers. That's pain, that's real, and that's okay, because that pain is the cost of being alive and being in this. You know, we can use all the adjectives we want about, you know, all those words at the start about what kind of times they are. There are always times like that. You know, this is Spanish flu, this is Black Plague, this is never-ending war between France and England. This is, you know, I'm not going to say this is invasion of First Nations around the world, because that's a level of pain that I have no idea about, that level of, you know, the theft of your land. But the pain is real. This is our pain. Right now, this is our pain. And one of the things that will help us get through with that yolk of the egg is what can I do? What can I do right now? So for me, right now, one of the things I feel better about today is I got to talk with all of you people and see the backdrops of your lives. And so I feel more connected to other human beings. And then, you know, I've supported some of the people who consult with me today, and they've supported me as well. You know, boundaries are kind of breaking down here. There's fluidity suddenly, there's room to move. Like, this is a liminal space. Like, go and read Rumi again, read about those doorways. This is a doorway and it's open, and that's terrifying. Like, that is terrifying. Never mind the pain of loss and grief. It's also terrifying because who knows what's on the other side of the door, but that's okay. It could be great. Could be great over there. Still be open. Don't close down.
That was, we went a little bit longer, but I'm so
sorry.
No, I'm so glad that we did, because that was the most perfect way to end this session. It was like a West Wing episode where you just wrapped up everything perfectly. And so thank you so much. I just wanted to do a little bit of admin as we kind of close the day. I wanted to thank very, very deeply Ruth and Lauren for joining us. I think your contributions were enormously helpful and really interesting. So thank you so much. Applause to you, and then I encourage everyone else to do that as well. It's wonderful to see you all. And then I think the other stuff is we do a feedback sheet at the end of all of these sessions. We'll email it out to you this afternoon. I really strongly encourage and ask you to complete that. We're obviously, you know, it's not for any reason other than we want to improve the quality of this for everybody. So I'm really, really keen to hear how you feel and how you think about how today has gone. We're also, I know a few people have asked for resources in the chat in the last like 10 to 15 minutes. So I might even like see if there's something that we can do to you know, share some kind of top line thoughts or things, because I know that Ruth and Lauren mentioned a few things throughout the day. I also just wanted to say thank you for joining us, and please join us next week. We're going to have another really, really strong slate of fantastic speakers. We've got Kelly O'Shaughnessy, the head of the Australian Climate Foundation, speaking on Monday, who is an incredibly inspirational person, and who has also come through, you know, the bushfires and now this, and is trying to navigate how those big things fit in with the climate emergency that is also a big pressing thing on all of our lives. Following on from that, we've got another update from the Essential team about how the Australian public opinion is sitting on all of these issues as it continues to evolve really quickly. I know a lot of people found that super insightful. And it's also a real privilege that they're sharing it. Often only, you know, the kind of really serious senior politicians get insight onto those kind of bits of information. So it's fantastic to see. On Wednesday, we've got a digital rights kind of, you know, digital sovereignty kind of conversation, which I think is really important given so many people have been asking, is Zoom, is Facebook, are these platforms we're turning to in this moment of need safe for us? So I encourage you to join for that conversation as well. And then finally on Thursday next week, we're going to be having a really interesting conversation about how First Nations people are affected and responding to this current situation with Linda Burney and a couple of other people too. So really exciting next week, but more importantly, I'm glad you've come today, and thank you again to Ruth and Lauren, and have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.
Bye.